All right. Thanks for your patience as I took roll and talked about weird things. So, all the stuff is due tomorrow, midnight-ish. I think now that I've gone back and kind of double checked the quiz, I think it should be available. If you notice that it's not, when you try to take it, let me know. Send an email and I'll try to monitor the email a little more closely over the next day or two. I've had a student or two, but I think not from your class, tell me that they haven't been able to access the weekly questions to turn them in on the assignments page, but I've graded some of them. So I think that it's really available. So I think that's probably more of an issue for that individual person rather than an issue on my end, but let me know. Oh, excuse me, sorry. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to tell you. I put the weekly questions for Unit 3 and Unit 4 in the course documents page. So those should be available. I haven't put them in the turn them in page, the assignments page, but my assumption is you're not quite ready to turn those in. And early next week, I'll make sure those are in there. Let's see, what else do you need to know? Somebody asked about book review. Is the book review mandatory assignment? Not really. If you want an A, you have to do the book review. Somebody asked, is it extra credit? Yeah, that's kind of how it works. Those points really are in addition to your point total. Somebody also emailed me yesterday and was frustrated because they'd gotten what they deemed to be like 90% on the first unit. However, when it showed up in the classroom, it showed up as a certain number of points, which they assumed was a percentage, which was frustrating to them. And sorry, I don't know what to tell you about that. I might be able to go back and change the settings to where it shows up as both points and a percentage, but just remember it's 300 points total, 70 or 80 points for each unit. Book review, it seems like that's due the last day of November. You can double check on the syllabus. Let me look really quick, because I think I had the syllabus up earlier yesterday, so should be handy. And all the due dates, there's a little section in the syllabus. See if I can find it. Okay, let me share, sorry. Sorry. Okay, sharing the screen, apologies. Syllabus. Now this is the, it's the week after Thanksgiving, I believe. So your chat is in the way. So there's a little chart in the syllabus. This is like page 4 of 6, it says. So the 4th page of the syllabus that tells you all the stuff and when it's due. So yeah, it is the 30th, which is a Monday. It's the Monday after Thanksgiving. I am not trying to ruin your time with your family. I'm not. And I think the CDC says you shouldn't have time with your family this year. That's really bad when the CDC is banning you from your family. But I get it, COVID, and they don't want a big group of you together, and they don't want you to harm the grandparents. So I get it. But you can also, if you are together with the family or with them remotely, ask them to look over your book review. Don't you all have that one relative that likes to edit your papers? I don't know if you do. Both of my parents used to be like that when we were little. Then we got older, they just didn't care. But when we were little, they always wanted to read stuff before we turned it in. So there you go. So there are all the due dates. So the due dates for the assignments are typically a Friday in the middle of the month. The last assignments are due the Friday of the last week, and then the book review on the Monday. So let me stop sharing that and see what you're asking. Oh, very nice to have the sister who's the English teacher and the mom. Yeah, no, all that stuff. Now, it's funny to see one of you write in the chat. I won't read the name, in case somebody actually watches the recording and then somebody tries to bribe you or blackmail you later that your mom did your dad's papers. That's funny. I know when my husband was in college, my husband I always like to clarify this. My husband went to college as an older person. He started at age 38. So, um, when I was clearly an older teacher and was saying my husband's in college, the kids would look at me like, oh my gosh, why are you dating an 18-year-old? It's like, no, people can go to college later. It's okay. And I did type his papers for him, but he'd had like 6 eye surgeries to that point. So I didn't write them. I typed them. I thought it was fair. And they didn't have very good the software where you can speak and then it types for you. Am I really? No, I'll stop talking about this because I know you're not here for that. No, you're not here for that at all. Oh, crud. I was about to share with you my comments on people's, that's not good. My comments on people's papers that I've graded thus far. So I don't want to share that. Sorry. So let me find the weekly questions and the notes, and then we'll finish talking about our stuff today. And I apologize for talking about all the other stuff. So sorry. All right. Poo-poo. All right. Somebody told me yesterday if I just keep the share your screen thing on, I don't have to close it as often as I do. So, sorry, I can't believe how much I'm still learning. It's not good, is it? All right, so identify the changes in American politics and society brought about by the New Deal, mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. So when you're answering that one, and we'll finish talking about that a little bit today, again, I would talk about how, and Foner talks about this a lot in the book, I would definitely talk about how people have decided that it really is the government's responsibility to help fix the economy and to help people who are impoverished. So moving away from, we don't want people to be too dependent on the government, laissez-faire, government should stay out of stuff, to government's got to fix stuff because they're the only ones who can. You could easily talk about John Maynard Keynes and the economic philosophy that says the government should have planned deficits in times of emergency. The specific laws you want to talk about, pick some New Deal agencies. It makes the most sense to me. Philosophies, Keynes for the economic philosophy, the general thing we just talked about. I think the obvious politician to talk about is FDR, but there are also some people who disagree with FDR and the New Deal, and you could talk about them as well. Now, if you're wondering like whose philosophy won out, FDR did get elected 4 times. So I'm going to suggest that FDR's did. However, it wasn't unanimous. I mean, there's always voices of dissent. I think there's always voices of dissent in US history. So there you go. All right, where are my notes? Oh my goodness. 18 to 21, are those the chapters we're on? Yeah, I think so. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'm assuming you can see the notes now. So bad with technology. All right, so Great Depression, that's where we were, right? Yes, of course it is. And if you have questions, put them in the chat and I'll look, I promise. All right, so I feel like we've already talked about most of this stuff. And again, I put the chart in there really not because, well, those are important New Deal agencies, and I think they do show the different things the New Deal did. You have some agencies where they created jobs, some where built dams, regulatory stuff. So part of the reason this is important is to help with flood control. But the other part of the reason that it was important was to help people get electricity. And you see that as well with the REA. And the REA is part of the reason that where I live in Williamson County, where we use the PEC, PEC is part of the REA. It's an extension of the REA. So TVA and REA give country folks some electricity, which we genuinely enjoy. I say this more from my more country days in Joplin, Missouri. I don't know that Leander's exactly the country, but it used to be. It's not exactly now. You also have FERA and other agencies where they directly gave assistance. You have AAA and NRA where they're going to regulate certain industries to try to make sure workers are treated a little better and to limit production, which production was part of the reason for the Great Depression, and then FDIC and Social Security, which FDIC regulates the banking industry. Social Security just creates a system of pensions for older folks, which, you know, maybe some of you will get when you get older. It's hard to say, oh, darn, you still see the weekly questions? Cried. Who's in charge of this? Thanks for telling me, though. Goodness. I'm going to try again. So sorry. Do you see the New Deal chart now? Gosh. So sad. So sad. Old people and technology. Again, I recognize that's not the issue. I know I've told you my almost 80-year-old dad makes fun of my tech skills. He has an online job. It's cool like that. All right, let's talk more directly about the New Deal and the critics of the New Deal. And then before we go, I'll kind of peek at let's see if we can do a quick review for the multiple choice, which clearly none of you have done since it wasn't very available. So apologies, although apparently didn't set any behind, which I'm glad. All right, New Deal is often broken up into two phases. The first New Deal, which is like, oh my gosh, people are broke, what can we do to help them? And I think we've seen, you know, in the current crisis, legislation that's very similar to that, where they're just trying to push money out there. Like, let's give the businesses some money, let's give unemployed people some money, let's give anyone who paid taxes some money. So, you know, the government's like, here's some cash, please go spend it. And that go spend it thing is supposed to keep the economy going. And, you know, again, I'm still shocked that they haven't done a second stimulus, because I would figure, you know, with unemployment numbers, I'm not really trying to talk about politics, so sorry. And with an election, you'd figure like, oh my gosh, politicians would just toss the cash out there, but they're not doing it. Now, during this time period, I am not trying to suggest that what goes on in the first New Deal is political. They really are trying to fix a problem. And throwing cash out there right now also is designed to fix a problem. So again, I just thought that the political motive would make them more likely to do it again. However, well, they're definitely, okay, sorry. I'm not trying to talk about politics. So more of a focus on relief in that first New Deal. So Emergency Banking Act, Securities and Exchange Commission, creation of the FDIC, which is hugely important, and is going, all of those things are going to make sure that the economic parts of regulation that weren't in place, economic regulations that weren't in place, that didn't, so the banking system, the Securities and Exchange, the stock market, didn't have protections at all and didn't really have any, goodness, they just didn't have rules about how you could trade, how you could buy, how you could sell. So this is going to stipulate what is legal, what is not legal. They're going to attach penalties. You're going to create a regulatory agency that monitors that. So that's going to get a lot more in check, until later on when they develop different ways of being sneaky, and then we'll have to regulate those. CCC, we've talked about 1 billion times. Exaggeration, of course, very popular. And there's a lot of discussion about whether it's the government's place to create jobs. Is the government supposed to be a job creator? Now, in general, most people are going to say like, no. But during this time period, most people are going to say yes. Some people are still going to say no. Pretty important for you to remember that the NRA and AAA are declared unconstitutional, seen as too much government interference in the private economy and regulation, in some instances that's intrastate rather than interstate, but both are struck down, which frustrates FDR, which is why he does the court reform plan, which is referred to as court packing, which becomes once again, kind of a current event because both parties are talking about the other party doing court packing and is it constitutional. In this era, when they talk about court packing, and honestly, until this election, when they talked about court packing, they really meant adding extra justices to the Supreme Court. Now, when you hear people talking about it in the modern political era, and by modern, I mean the last month, they're talking as much about, adding somebody late in the game or what the Republicans have done in this last administration to put as many judges as possible in place, which isn't the same as what they were talking about when they talked about court packing with FDR, which was adding judges to the Supreme Court. Unemployment during this time period, even with the first New Deal, was really bad, 20%. I think nationally it's around 9%, 9 to 10%. I have not kept up with the unemployment numbers, but we've never had a situation outside of this time period where it's at 20% no matter what the government seemed to do. Now, in some states, it was as high as 50%. Those typically farming states, but the average in the country was about 20%, and that's even with the government instituting dozens of programs and spending just an amazing amount of money to try to stimulate the economy. So the economy did show some improvement. People were okay with this, I think, in general, not the economy being bad, but the government being more involved, because it did give them the feeling that the government was concerned about their welfare, and it did help some. Even though it doesn't fix unemployment, it does give resources to some of the people who are unemployed. And if you don't have money coming in, extra resources, that's pretty useful stuff. Yeah, trust me on that. Hopefully you don't get to experience that, but that's rough stuff when you don't have a job. It is. All right. Unless you're like 80, although my dad's 80 and he has a job. Yeah. Excuse me. All right. Second New Deal, really more of a focus on economic security, trying to make sure that what they had fixed stays fixed and what had gone wrong before doesn't go wrong again. So Works Progress Administration and Public Works Administration creating a couple more agencies to create more public works jobs. And some of these people think are really good. They're building roads, they're building bridges, they're building schools, they're building post offices, that sort of thing. Sometimes, though, they've got these projects that people will think of as government excess. I think the most often quoted or cited example during that time period is there's a works program in some city, I think it's in the Midwest, I want to say it's Chicago, but I don't remember for sure, where they have 2 shifts of workers, and one shift digs the hole and the second shift fills the hole back up. So there are times that they create just useless jobs, and really the goal of that administration overall is to get money in circulation, to get money out there so people are spending it. So to give people a job where they feel like they're earning the money rather than you just handing them the money. But yeah, when you're filling up the hole that someone else dug, probably doesn't look as good. Now, most of the jobs created by that agency are not fill the hole kind of jobs. They're really not. But people who analyze the New Deal agencies will note that the WPA in particular had instances where the quality of their work was very poor or unnecessary. We'll go with that. Sometimes they said WPA stood for We Putter Around. Very rude, right? Although in some instances it was seen as government excess. The Wagner Act replaces the NRA, sorry, distracted there, and they create Social Security in the second New Deal, which is really kind of an outgrowth of the ideas of Francis Townsend, who we'll talk about here in a second in the Critics of the New Deal section. And of course, the Rural Electrification Agency in this part of the country. We should all be thankful for that, probably. Although I know some of you are going, if they hadn't had a government agency, the market would have brought electricity out this way anyway. Yeah, probably. So would have been really expensive for country folk. And eventually, maybe, once it's populated, the prices would have been better. But 90% of the farms had electricity at the end of this program, where 80% didn't at the beginning. So this really is a dramatic improvement in day-to-day life for country folks. So I say that as a former country folk. So I'm glad for that. All right. People that did not like the New Deal, besides some Republicans, especially conservative or really more libertarian, they wouldn't have called him libertarian during that time period, but the idea that government should stay out of business and individuals' business, but actual business, those kind of Republicans didn't like the New Deal. But, excuse me, it was hard to argue that it wasn't necessary. At least they thought, I don't even know. All right. Most people wanted it clearly because, FDR kept getting reelected. Now, there were some Democrats. If you want to read about a weird dude for your book review, I don't know if there's any weirder dude. There's a lot of weird dudes in U.S. history. But Huey Long is one of the weirdest dudes you're ever going to read about. He is all the stereotypes of a corrupt politician. He's from Louisiana. He's kind of a country dude. But he is on the take from anybody that will give him something to take. So he'll take a bribe, he'll give a bribe, he'll just do whatever he thinks he needs to do to get things done. Now, when FDR is running for president in 32, his concern, because he is kind of a New York City dude with lots of money, his concern is he's not going to be very appealing in the South. And you have to win the South to win the presidency. And especially if you're a Democrat, because your party's really fractured between cities in the North and the South. So FDR asked Huey Long, who's a very prominent politician in Louisiana, asked him to run the southern part of his campaign. So Huey Long went around southern states campaigning for FDR and helped FDR get elected. And then Huey Long thought, he really is not helping country people as much as I thought. Plus, he only won because I'm a great politician. Huey Long didn't really lack confidence. And if I run for president as a Democrat, I bet I would win. So Huey Long decided he would run against FDR in 1936 for the Democratic Party nomination. And he started something called the Share Our Wealth Foundation. Now, Huey Long, what a character. Started off as a local politician and then a state politician, got elected to be the governor of Louisiana. And he had a wife and family who were very highly thought of, prominent socially, that sort of thing. But he also had a girlfriend, and he hired his girlfriend was a stripper. Everybody's got to have a job, so, but he hired his girlfriend when he was governor to be his secretary. I don't know if she kept the evening job or not, but his family lived in the governor's mansion and he lived in an apartment with his girlfriend. He was a character for sure. And he either knew something that he could bribe you with to get your support, or knew something about you that he could blackmail you with. So he was a very effective politician. Wasn't necessarily always for positive reasons, but you got to know stuff, and he knew stuff. And he's very charismatic as well. He's really a charismatic person. So people liked him even if they didn't want to like him, I think was a weird thing about him, or an effective thing about him. But he thought that the New Deal just wasn't helping enough people, and that it tended to help wealthier people and big business more than it helped poor country people and small business. And most critics of the New Deal would agree with that. So he proposed a 100% tax on people with incomes over $1 million. Not on people, but on incomes over $1 million. So if you are like me and have this great job at Austin Community College where you get paid $1.5 million a year, I'm lying, of course, I would get to keep the million and it would be taxed at the regular rate, but the 500,000 above that would be taxed at 100%. So that would all go directly to the government. And I know some of you are going like, well, that's not fair. When I make that much money someday, I wouldn't like that. Yeah, nobody thought like that in the 30s because everybody's broke. So they thought anybody making $1 million during this time period, over $1 million, was really doing it because they were just horrible people who were dishonest and scamming money off the downtrodden. I mean, they just thought it was heinous to make over $1 million in the middle of the Great Depression. So there's not much sympathy for multimillionaires during this time period. Now, notice that this is income, so it's not if you already had it. And typically when you notice, sorry, turn off the phone so it won't beep. Typically, if you notice tax bills, I don't know how much you pay attention to how income or wealth is taxed. Typically, people who write those bills or push for those bills to be written are fairly wealthy and they have money, they already have money. So they tend to want to tax income rather than money that you already have. So wealth, so which is a moderately interesting thing to notice. However, Huey Long said we would tax at 100% incomes over $1 million and then use that money to make sure everyone in the country had a minimum income. And if you were watching the Democratic Party primaries, there was one guy in there that had a semi-similar philosophy, although he didn't have the same background, and that was that Andrew Yang fellow, who is still arguing that everyone should get a certain amount of money each week from the government. I think it was $1,000 a week. $1,000 a week, that would add up, wouldn't it? That'd be good. Except I know there's no free money. Somebody's got to pay for it. And in the modern era, this taxing people over $1 million at 100% wouldn't go over too well. Because I've had students argue, $1 million a year isn't that much. It's like, yeah, I don't know what you're doing for a living. But anyway, so this confiscation would pay for everyone to be guaranteed a $5,000 homestead, so everybody would own a house, and a $2,500 annual income. And if you're wondering, was that a lot during this time period? Could you live on that? Honestly, yeah. A $5,000 house in the 30s would be a very nice house. I mean, it would probably be comparable. I don't mean it would be a mansion or anything, but it'd be comparable to, like an ACC teacher house. It'd be nice. Yeah, you could live in it. It was safe and have enough room, that sort of thing. And $2,500 annual income was more than the average income during that era. So, it's more than what you would think of as minimum wage. So these proposals were pretty popular with poor people, especially rural poor people in the country. And he decided he would run against FDR in 36. So he ran for Senate to get a little more national exposure and got elected. I think he got elected in 34. Pretty sure I'm right about that. Then he gets assassinated in 35 as he's leaving a Senate committee hearing. I know that people sort of speculated, about who it was. Your book talks about how he had angered a lot of people. That's an understatement. And that one of those sought revenge and murdered him. So, and I know that that's the established story. So you know how there's always a conspiracy about everything. So, but the established story, murdered by an angry constituent, someone in Louisiana whose family he's offended, something along those lines. I believe that's true. I'm not trying to suggest. Okay. All right. So he's a really fascinating critic, interesting guy. There are lots of books written about him if you ever want to read about him. There was a movie, I think it was an HBO movie, because I remember I was teaching high school at the time and the kids said, can we watch it? And I went, absolutely not, because, it was an accurate movie and he most of the stuff he did, you can't really show in a movie to high school students. So there you go. Excuse me. Francis Townsend, not nearly as interesting. And you could show a movie about him. It just wouldn't be as exciting, I think. He was a doctor, I believe, lived in California, and he got cancer when he was a little older, and miraculously had some treatment that helped him, and he recovered from cancer. And I say that because it was the 30s. I'm not saying that it's miraculous that people recover from cancer, although it's still quite amazing. But I know it's more common now than it was then. Medical treatment then also is still really iffy. You know, you might be better off not getting medical treatment. It's starting to get better by the 30s, but it's still a little iffy. So Dr. Townsend gets better. And when he's recovered, his thought is, most people my age, because he was 60-ish, wouldn't have had the money to get the treatment that I had. Plus, most people my age probably shouldn't be working, because life expectancy then was about 60. So he proposes that older people should withdraw from the workforce and get $200 a month, which would have been enough to live on during that time period. But they were required to spend all of it. They weren't supposed to, so they were supposed to get a limited income. And the reason for that is they wanted them to spend all of it. And it would take them out of the workforce, and then it could also help provide for medical care. Now, when they do pass Social Security, it doesn't have provisions for medical care. They'll add that later. But his thought was, if we get the old folks out of the workforce and then give them a little bit of money each month so they spend it, so that's good for the economy. And we give them medical care, because who can afford that? Then this would be good for the economy overall. And of course, the system they create requires you to pay in to save up that money. So when you're taking it out, it's from a fund that's been created over years. So that's the precursor or predecessor to Social Security. And then there's another critic of the New Deal. Just noticing my dots don't line up. Sorry for all of you OCD people there. Father Charles Coughlin, who's like a really weird racist priest, and it has a big radio show. During that time period, the biggest means of entertainment communication was radio, and radio shows were pretty trendy. He had one of the biggest radio shows in the country. I think he had about 30 million listeners, which is going to be, you know, about a third of the working adults. It's a lot of people. And I think in the modern era, there aren't that many people that have big radio shows, but I also know, you know, most of us don't listen to the radio with regularity. This Charles Coughlin fellow was called the Radio Priest, and his family had emigrated from Ireland to Canada, where he was born, and then he ended up in the United States. And I don't know if it was New York. I don't know why I don't remember where he lived. Clearly, that's not going to be a test question. I guess it doesn't have a great consequence. Sorry. But when Roosevelt ran, he really liked Roosevelt because it seemed like Roosevelt was going to be very helpful to the average poor person. So he said, we have to vote for Roosevelt. It's Roosevelt or ruin, which was his famous quote, I suppose. And then after Roosevelt got elected, like Huey Long, he didn't think that Roosevelt did enough to help the average person. He thought that most of the legislation that was passed in the New Deal, was more helpful to bankers and Wall Streeters, to corporate types. And he also noted quite often in his radio show that those corporate types tended to be the Jews. So yes, he's going to be an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish radio priest. I always tell people, like, you know, he was from Canada. What can you expect from people from, no, we don't want to blame Canadians for that. But, you know, this will look bad later, not much later. But anti-Semitism, I know we're clearly going to get to discuss that when we talk about World War II in the next chapter. But anti-Semitism wasn't just a German thing during this time period, which is part of the reason probably it took the world a little longer to push back against it than we would like in retrospect. So, yeah. All right. Charles Coughlin still maintained a pretty large radio audience and was fairly popular still, which is why the election in 1936 was probably a little closer than FDR would hope. All right, other stuff. Ideas of freedom of contract and liberty concerned the Supreme Court, who declared the AAA and NRA unconstitutional, delegated congressional regulatory powers to the executive branch. I feel like we've talked about this in different terms, though. So, and the book talks really specifically about this, so be sure to peek at that. FDR threatens to reorganize the court. He called it the Supreme Court Reform Plan, and we've talked about that before. The plan did seem excessive to the American public. FDR made a direct appeal to the American public, said call your senator, call your congressman, you know, the House or the rep or your senator, tell them what you think about my plan. And people did, and they all thought, not all of them, but the majority of the people who commented about it seemed to think it was more power than FDR should want. Yeah, that there was too much. So it was seen as excessive, but the court, maybe the court got the message, or maybe they had already declared unconstitutional what they truly thought was unconstitutional, but the court didn't overturn any other parts of the New Deal. So, and the court does see liberty as inclusive of health, safety, morals, and welfare for the American population. So you're seeing a shift in the federal government, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch, where they start to see their role as protecting health, safety, morals, and welfare, which is going to also push for a justification of entering World War II, although there are very few people who are going to argue we shouldn't have gone to World War II. All right, other stuff that's going on. Conservation becomes more important after the Dust Bowl. Dust Bowl is a phenomenon in the Midwest where, or the Great Plains, the farming parts of the Great Plains, where the soil has probably just been overused. So rather than, I mean, the idea that you would leave one part, a fourth, potentially, usually, of your field fallow where you didn't grow anything. It took a year off about every 4 years. People weren't observing that during this time period, so they wore the soil out. And then the Dust Bowl is really a big drought, and then it's followed by wind, and the topsoil literally blows away because it's just worn out and there's nothing holding it down. It'd been over-farmed. So Conservation Service, WPA, going to have projects to repair the soil. And it's not conservation, I think, in the modern era where they do lots of studies, that kind of stuff, but it's fairly important stuff. And also they're going to dam rivers, try to restore eroded land. And a lot of this is for economic purposes as well. So, and those two things can go hand in hand, conservation and economic improvement. And, you know, again, they're not talking fracking or any of that kind of stuff during this era because it's early. It's too early for that. Women are going to play a larger role in national politics. Eleanor Roosevelt would kind of set the example, who pushes for labor and civil rights. She refers to herself as her husband's legs because he's not as out there because of the polio. She doesn't refer to herself in that way very publicly because of things we've talked about before. But she is really much more concerned about social issues than he is, and will kind of push him in ways that he probably wouldn't have gone otherwise. Now, I am not trying to suggest to you that he's like some racist capitalist kind of dude that doesn't care about poor people. He has two major issues to deal with in his presidency: Great Depression, World War II. Those are fairly consuming. So and again, I'm not saying you can't do more than one thing at a time, but those are two really big things. So those are his big foci, can I say that? Focuses. But Mrs. Roosevelt tours the country, starts lots of projects in poor areas, especially the Appalachians, which is like the Ozark region of the East. So those are my people a little farther east. She also is big into civil rights in ways that other people are not just yet, and probably helps to push her husband in that direction, to the point where he has a group of African American advisors who are referred to as the Black Cabinet. FDR also will appoint the first female Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Mary McLeod Bethune, who's a pretty famous educator. The Bethune-Cookman College of Education in DC is named after her. She's going to be part of the WPA, and Robert Hastie, and it's Robert Hastie, William Hastie, Robert Weaver. I get the names backwards, but FDR is going to have African American advisors. Now, people are going to argue he doesn't listen to them often enough. So this is really kind of a start, but it's, you know, it's the beginning of something. It's not the culmination of something. It's the beginning of something. Eleanor Roosevelt, super interesting person. She'll outlive her husband by quite a bit. She and her husband had really interesting family life, so you could read a biography about her as a public person or as a private person. It would be relatively interesting, I would think. Things, I don't know, just trivia, I guess, kind of stuff. They had an unusual marriage relationship, my opinion. I know I'm judging them, and I'll just freely admit I'm making a value judgment a little bit by saying that they're unusual, whereas they could, I don't know that they were officially an open marriage, but he had a girlfriend and she also dated on occasion. Although they had an unusual respect and commitment to each other, but it apparently wasn't exclusive in the romantic sense. We'll just go with that. So when well, we'll talk about that later, okay? Because it's not terribly relevant, but it's moderately interesting, perhaps, okay. The Marian Anderson thing, very interesting, and you could probably read some specific stuff about that. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is like a pretty frou-frou group of people who can trace their lineage back to a very old time in our history. This tends to be old wealthy families. We'll just go with that. It's not all, but it tends to be old wealthy families, which clearly the Roosevelts were. So they have an annual meeting, which of course Mrs. Roosevelt doesn't attend all the time while she's First Lady, but they were having an annual conference in Philadelphia, and they invited a very famous opera singer, Marian Anderson, to come sing. Now, I mentioned that the main form of entertainment was radio, correct? I don't know how this slipped out, or you know, how this slipped over people's observation. They didn't notice that Marian Anderson was Black. So whoever booked her, I guess, didn't think about it, didn't know, whatever. Constitution Hall, where they were having the meeting, was a segregated place. So when she came to perform, or shortly before, they told her she would not be allowed to perform there because she was Black and the meeting was segregated. Eleanor Roosevelt quit the DAR over this. She said, I'm not going to be part of a racist group, and arranged for Marian Anderson to sing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which seems like an appropriate place for such a thing. And people began to see the government as maybe having a role in ending segregation. Very tiny, tiny opening, but a beginning of something as well. Small stuff. Okay. Now, I just mentioned that there's a little bit of hope, a little bit of opening. There's also some issues. This is not, the New Deal is not going to tackle issues of race or ethnicity. So here comes the whole list of ways that we can show proof of that. African Americans, while included in the New Deal, were allowed to be paid on a separate scale through the NRA or exempted from Social Security, not specifically, like it doesn't say in there, African Americans don't get to collect Social Security. What it does is it exempts categories of workers that Southerners and African Americans participate in large numbers. Agricultural workers, so if you didn't own the land, once again, you don't pay into Social Security, so you don't take out. Domestic workers, so if you cook, clean, take care of somebody's kids, that kind of stuff, you don't pay in, you don't take out. And the book does a really good job in this section of talking about how culturally we stigmatized certain programs, welfare programs, that tended to benefit the people who were exempted from these other New Deal programs, which, you know, if you study American history, and again, I am not one of those people that thinks like the United States is the most heinous country in the history of countries. I really don't at all. I think, you know, our history is filled with some amazingly great things and some unusually terrible things, and it's a mix. And one of the things I like about our country is that we have the ability built into our governmental system to fix those things. That also leaves us with the obligation to fix those things, my opinion, which sometimes we ignore. But this is, yeah, that section where they talk about the stigmas that are created by the programs that tend to help the poorest people who are exempt from the New Deal programs that seem to be socially acceptable. That is a fascinatingly important section, I think. I really think it is. But you look at it, you get to judge it for what it is. And that's always tricky too when you read a part of your history book where it suggests those sorts of things, because I realize that's not necessarily straight factual stuff, but it, you know, I would look at it and you decide what to do with it. Okay. All right. Blacks are often last hired, first fired. And Black cabinet's a start. And there are important starts that happen during this era, but it's definitely not a fix. I promise you, it's not the culmination that we're looking for. And you'll see elements of that as we go along. Indian New Deal ends the policy of assimilation, reverses the Dawes Act. So this happens in the 30s. The Dawes Act happened 50 years previously. So it's like, yeah, no more boarding schools. You can do whatever you want with your tribal land. You can govern yourselves. This doesn't change very much because after 50 years, the culture had changed pretty dramatically. Plus, the money that had been, you know, the land that had been sold, the money that had been spent on boarding schools wasn't reinvested in the tribe. And when they end the policy of assimilation, they're also going to cut back on government payments to Native Americans and reservations. So it's the Great Depression, they're going to spend less money there. So it's like, hey, you guys do your own thing now and you don't get any money. So, and it's the Great Depression. So good luck to you. Here's one of our favorite things in the Southwest to talk about. Mexican Americans are going to be relocated, I believe is how the book calls it, or returned to Mexico, or deported. We'll go with that. And one of the things that was tricky about this is they deported, with immigration sweeps, they deported people who had never lived anywhere but the United States. So when you get deported and they put you on that $12 train ride from El Paso or Los Angeles to Mexico City, which is a really cheap train ride, which is why the government did it, and you've never actually been to Mexico City and you don't have family there, it's kind of not cool. This is going to develop a feeling among Mexican Americans that maybe the US government wasn't exactly in their favor. And there'll be repression of farm workers that try to form unions, which is later on why Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are so important to the Mexican American rights movement, and groups like the American GI Forum, which we'll talk about. Yeah. All right. All right. And I really think if you look at history of movement across the Mexican border, immigration, relocation, that sort of thing, deportation, what you notice very consistently is when the economy is good, We don't care how many people from Mexico live in the United States. When the economy is bad, we want to deport people. That's just kind of the thing. Communism trendy at the height of the Great Depression, Popular Front, Communist Party, Socialist Party, pretty respectable. College groups of these were very popular because, you know, upper middle class and upper class folks, no jobs really, so kids went to college more. And these groups apparently threw nice parties where they had good discussion and free food. And you guys know good discussion and free food are a nice combination, especially when you're broke. So just kind of a gentle reminder that these things weren't seen as anathema, where you just can't talk about this stuff. But this will be a problem later on because, excuse me, after World War II, when we're done being upset with Hitler, or, then we're going to turn to being upset with Stalin, which he earns. I'm not suggesting he didn't. But we're also going to become very anti-communist, anti-socialist. So people who had been a part of these movements in the 30s, which were considered respectable and legitimate in the 30s, are now going to be in some trouble in the 50s. And then some New Deal programs really kind of help document some important things in our history. All the pictures, not all, but a lot of the pictures that you see of the Dust Bowl and the movement of agricultural workers from the Midwest to California are from Dorothea Lange. There's a program to help write down slave narratives, although I realize too that the dialect that's used is not ideal. I get it. But there's some history preserved. And popular film during this time period really dignifies the struggle of the common man. And you see writing that does the same thing. Charles Hamilton Houston, who is a graduate of Harvard Law, who creates Howard Law School, historically Black college in DC, and trains guys like Thurgood Marshall. He's really important law pioneer who works for the NAACP. And then Paul Robeson, oh my goodness, if you want to read a book about a fascinating dude, that might be your dude. Paul Robeson went to Cornell, had a degree, law degree, was also a professional football player, although I know the NFL wasn't, or you know, professional football was not the biggest thing back then. But he was a highly skilled athlete, a lawyer, and he ended up making a career being an opera singer. There aren't too many people with that range of skill, and then ends up being a labor, like an international labor leader. He's a really interesting guy. He's really kind of written out of common history books because later on he's just going to say, you know what, I think communism's a better philosophy. So he's an interesting fellow. When he gave concerts in the 30s, he would not give a concert unless the audience was integrated. And that was a requirement. And people would integrate their audiences just to have him give a concert. I mean, people would violate the local laws for that purpose. So Paul Robeson was a really well-known, important person in his era who kind of gets written out of history because he's essentially communist. So interesting. And did I mention, both these guys are Black. I don't know if I mentioned that. And then there's a really tragic court case about the Scottsboro Boys. You could read about that for book review as well. There's lots of good stuff written. There's some professor, history professor at LSU, and I can't think of his name right now, but he wrote a really good book about the Scottsboro Boys, which, hang on, I'm checking that. Okay. Yeah, no, yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate you guys letting me know when you got to check out. But the Scottsboro Boys, I think I talked about this before maybe. During this time period, especially South and Midwest, where there's just no jobs in agricultural places, pretty common for people just to hop on trains and go to the next community to look for work. And these trains they're cargo trains, they're not passenger trains. So you would ride in with the car of wheat or the car of coal or whatever. And people self-segregated, the hobos, they called them hobos. And when they talked about hobos in this era, they really meant train hopping dudes. That was very specific terminology for that. And the hobos would self-segregate. And also there were apparently hobo prostitutes because everybody's got to make a living. And they would go from car to car selling their services, that sort of thing. And there were some hobo prostitutes that got caught in, I think it's Scottsboro is the name of the town, Alabama. And the hobo prostitutes were teenage white girls, and they did not discriminate. And so when they were caught, they were in the boxcar with the African American men. And they said that they had been raped because they figured that would be a more acceptable thing for them to say. They'd get in less trouble. So there were 9 men, well, boys, I think the youngest one was 13. And they all got arrested and sentenced, convicted and sentenced to death. And then the young women, honestly, before the sentencing happened, the young women they recanted their story and said, we just made it up because we didn't want to get in trouble. We don't want to see these guys killed. Didn't really matter. They stayed in jail for, I think it was 12 years. And a couple of them died in jail. It's super tragic stuff. Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. See your faces there, those of you that have your faces. So that's a cheery way to end the chapter, isn't it? But yeah. So the New Deal changes a lot of things. Notice that we're really slow about wanting to change racial and ethnic equality. You see beginnings of that during this time period, and then you'll see, I really think what you'll notice, and I'll probably ask you to notice this, so I'm sorry to impose a view on you, how World War II really impacts and hastens those changes. I think the other thing I wanted to look at without sharing with you, see if I can find it, maybe to go over the weekly questions just a little, or not the weekly questions, but the timed questions, just a little bit. Because I know I gave you a review list. So from this chapter, the stuff you probably want to really pay attention to while you're studying or kind of reviewing. Just in general, what is the New Deal? So, how just recognize, of course, that those are FDR's pretty general promises to try all kinds of new stuff to end the Great Depression. So it's not like he came out with a super specific plan. He just said, we're going to keep trying stuff till we figure out something that works. Make sure you're familiar with the CCC, the NRA, and the AAA. And just in general, that the NRA and AAA got declared unconstitutional because they were seen as too much government control in the economy and, excuse me, there for the gasp, the executive branch taking over some of the duties of the legislative branch. I think I would just in general notice that Eleanor Roosevelt was very non-traditional, that she had her own causes, that she really kind of redefines the role of First Lady as more, somebody who takes up a cause or 2 or 10 with her and follows up on it. And I did have a question about the Scottsboro case on there, so make sure that you have a little familiarity with that as well. All right, I know we're almost out of time, so let me stop, see if you guys have any questions. Yeah, I've noticed. Now, I don't ever want to, again, political. I know one of you made a political comment in there, which is you guys comment about whatever you want. It doesn't bug me, and I don't want to censor any of that kind of stuff. I don't want to limit it at all because I just, I do what everything. I do think it is. I'm cynical about all politicians. I hate to just be that way. I'd like to be more optimistic, but I do think that both parties are playing games. They figure whatever they do right now will help them more in the election. So I don't know. But I don't know if you ever want to be as cynical as I am with politicians. Not cynical about life. I just always assume they're up to something. But But I also get, my older brother is also cynical about politicians, but much more favorable. He really likes one party more than the other. And he'll always tell me his favorite quote from, it's always good when you have family members that have favorite quotes from historical people. From Winston Churchill was something like, anyone who is 20 and a conservative has no heart. Anyone who is 30 and a liberal has no brain. I'm not agreeing with that. I'm just telling you that that was my brother's favorite quote. And I do think sometimes when we're younger, we just want to fix all the problems. When we're older, it's like, I don't know if we can fix all the problems. I don't know. People should study that, not me, right? I'm sorry. Do you guys have questions? Is there anything you guys would like to ask related to the material? Anything you want to ask before we go? Because I know we need to go. So I apologize for kind of going on there. Okay, question.
Yeah, I got a question, Professor.
All right, let's hear it.
For the weekly question, is it just the first New Deal or also the second New Deal?
You could talk about both. I mean, you could, or you could talk about either. So it was, if you're talking specifically about which parts of the New Deal, specific laws you want to discuss, just pick 2 or 3, whichever you think are most important. And it could be from either one. But yeah, the New Deal overall is both parts.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. And I think I'll go ahead and stop.